And welcome to another episode of Primility Primer, our morning reminder of the power of balancing pride and humility as we go about our daily lives. This is episode number 40. I am your host, Jared Morris. And of all the episodes that I have done and that I will do of Primility Primer, I will say that none of them really had predetermined topics based on number, except for one. And that's episode number 40. And 40 is my lucky number, which is why the topic was probably predetermined, what I would talk about, who I would talk about. And that is a guy named Calbert Cheaney, who was a role model for me growing up. He wore the number 40 for Indiana, played basketball at Indiana University, scored more points during his career than anyone else in the history of the Big Ten, 2,613. And so if I've ever sent you an email and you've seen the Jared Morris 40 at gmail.com, that 40 is for Calbert Cheaney, who played at Indiana from 1990 to 1993, which is when I was about 9 to 13. So at a very impressionable age as I was growing up. And what I always liked about Calbert and what I really appreciate about him as I look back now on myself back then was not just that he was a great player and that watching him and going to games inspired me to be a basketball player, but it was the way that he did it. You know, Calbert was a guy when he came into Indiana that was part of one of the biggest recruiting classes in school history, but wasn't one of the headliners. And no one had real big expectations of him. Yet from day one, he led the team in scoring, was team MVP 4 times, and again, ended up scoring more points in his career than anyone else in the history of the Big Ten, a conference with a very storied basketball history. And it's interesting because he stood out so much individually, you know, with the points that he scored because he was such a team player. He functioned within the motion offense of Bob Knight's, and he happened to be the most complete offensive player, and the offense kind of went through him and was designed to get him shots, and he took advantage of it. And his ability and willingness to take and make shots, along with his ability and willingness to function inside of the team concept, which really is that is the essence of Primility right there, was one of the reasons why he was such a good player. But he was also a great example off the court of doing the right things, going to class, going out in the community. You know, I got the opportunity to see him speak, he and some of the other players when I was younger. And just every interaction that I had with him from afar up close was positive. He was a role model for me. Now, look, my parents, my mom and dad, obviously the two biggest role models that I've had in my life, and they've done a great job. But I grew up around sports, which is one of the reasons why I relate a lot of what we talk about here on Primility to sports. And I was really fortunate growing up around the Indiana football team and watching the Indiana basketball team to be around athletes who took their roles as role models seriously. You know, guys like Anthony Thompson, who finished second in the Heisman Trophy voting in 1989, a great player, one of the greatest football players in Big Ten history. Another guy who took his role as a role model seriously. Calbert was the same, and there are so many other individuals that I could pull out and name from that era of Indiana sports, which I was so close to, and so it is my frame of reference. And I opened this episode of Primility Primer with that because I want to frame the context of what I'm about to say, because those are the athletes I grew up with. They were terrific role models. I learned a lot from them. And then you contrast that with a guy like Charles Barkley, who, look, Charles Barkley has said a lot of smart and insightful things. But one of the more infamous statements that he has made was on a Nike commercial when he said, "I am not a role model." And in fact, let me read you the entire commercial here. "I am not a role model. I'm not paid to be a role model. I'm paid to wreak havoc on the basketball court. Parents should be role models. Just because I dunk a basketball doesn't mean I should raise your kids." So clearly he's right that parents should be role models. So we agree on that part. But it is so disingenuous at the end for him to say, just because I dunk a basketball doesn't mean I should raise your kids. Being a role model doesn't mean that you are raising somebody. It doesn't mean that you are responsible for their actions. What it means is that you are responsible for your actions and the example that you set. Because here's the thing about being a role model that I have come to learn as I've gotten older is we don't get to choose whether we are role models or not. other people choose us as role models, and then we get to choose the example that we set, and we can be positive role models, we can be indifferent role models, and we can be negative role models, just depending on the example that we set. So whether I want to be or not, with this show Primility Primer, I am a role model of a podcaster, of a showrunner, because I set out to do a daily show. If I miss every other day, if I'm not here, if I'm not prepared, I am modeling bad podcasting behavior. And anybody who watches this, they may say, well, he runs a podcasting course. He runs 4 or 5 other shows. Maybe it's okay for me to do this, right? The same thing, if we go back to my earlier example with a guy like Calbert Cheaney, he could have been a selfish player. He could have gotten in trouble off the court. He could have been arrogant, right? He could have been all of these other things that would not have been positive examples for someone like me, who would go out after the games, go out in my driveway and pretend that I was Calbert Cheaney, right? Well, I think the fact that I was pretending to be a guy who so clearly at the time, and has shown throughout his career now, through his NBA career and the work he's done now as a coach, continuing to work with young people and give back, this is a guy who is a positive role model in what he does. And that has had an impact on me. And so I'm grateful that he chose to be a positive role model, that he had parents who instilled good lessons in him, and that what he took from Coach Knight and his experience in Indiana, and that all of these things coalesced into him being a positive role model. And I just think it's a cop-out for any of us to say or think that we are not role models, because we are. Again, it comes back to how we want to model, what kind of role model we want to be. And I think this does come back to Primility, because I think there are a few reasons why we might think we're not a role model. And one is just having such excess pride, being so conceited, thinking only of ourselves, that we just don't even consider anybody else. We don't consider the impact that we have on other people. And we don't want any sense of responsibility to other people to change the decisions that we make, because we think in a self-serving way, right? That's one reason. The other reason is to think that we don't have anything to offer, that no one would be watching us. But that couldn't be further from the truth. I think even people that we're in relationships with, we are role models for each other, because we are always going to be impacted and affected by the people that we're closest to. Our coworkers, we are role models for each other. If I'm modeling bad work behavior, other people that I work with may see that and think, well, he's doing it, so it's okay. Because I may look at them and think the exact same thing. The more that we model good behaviors for each other and reinforce that for each other, no matter what it is, the better we're going to be. And that all is caught up in that term, that phrase, role model. So to ever say I am not a role model is to completely shirk the responsibility that we have to each other, not just athletes to little kids that grow up watching them, but professionally, personally, interpersonally, we all have a responsibility to each other and to be our best selves, to be role models. And I think taking pride in that responsibility, but then having the humility to understand the impact that we have on other people, whether we want to or not, that's what brings us back to this choice: to be a positive role model, to be an indifferent role model, to be a negative role model. I want to be a positive role model. What kind of role model do you want to be? Thank you very much for listening or watching to this episode of Primility Primer. I always appreciate your time. Go to primility.com/join. Get on our email list. You will not only get our Monday morning email, it's short, it's a positive thought, but you'll also get our Friday morning digest email so that you can stay caught up with Primility Primer. And if you do, by the way, if you want to see that Charles Barkley commercial, if you've forgotten about it, go to primility.com/show/040. And there's a link to that commercial right there so you can watch it. Thanks again for watching. We'll be back tomorrow with another brand new episode of Primility Primer. Until then, wrist bump.